Hi, my name is Zvezdana Varizic. In this presentation, I will talk about family language policy. We will start by defining family language policy. Then we will identify the components of family language policy, describe the types of outcomes of family language policies, and discuss linguistic outcomes for children and factors affecting them. Family language policy can be defined as explicit and overt planning in relation to language use within the home among family members. However, family language policy is believed also to include implicit and covert actions in relation to language use within the home. Family language policy has three main components: language beliefs and ideologies, or ways of thinking about and dispositions toward language practices, or different ways of using language management, or varied efforts to modify and influence language use. Family language policy can have three types of outcomes or results: linguistic outcomes, which encompass language proficiency, language use, and language maintenance or shift; socio-emotional outcomes, which encompass positive or negative emotions related to language proficiency or use; socio-emotional well-being reflected in family relations, identity, connections to heritage culture, etc. And cognitive outcomes, which encompass inhibitory control, selective attention, working memory, metalinguistic awareness, etc. In the remainder of this presentation, we will discuss linguistic outcomes for children and the role of parents' language behavior, beliefs, and ideologies, and language management efforts in children's language development. The main factors affecting the success in language learning and use are input, age of the learner, and language attitudes, as you can see in the graph on the right. The relationship between input, proficiency, and use is cyclical, as shown in the graph. These factors are closely related and mutually reinforcing. Greater input leads to greater proficiency. Greater language proficiency encourages greater language use. Greater language use increases proficiency, but also through increased communication, invites more language input, which leads to continued learning and proficiency, and so on. The younger age of the learner is helpful for language development, but it is not deterministic. Positive language attitudes are critical for both the successful learning and willing language use. As mentioned earlier, exposure to a language is critical for the child's language proficiency and use. Parents' language practices and language management efforts can affect a child's language input. They are especially important for the development of a minority language because the child typically has fewer opportunities for exposure to it and its use. Should be noted that the development of the minority language doesn't exert any negative effect on the proficiency in the majority language. Language learning depends on both the quantity and quality of input. It requires a sufficient amount of exposure to a language, quantity of input, and a rich and varied input and sufficiently learner-centered communication, quality of input. In terms of the quantity of input, adequate language acquisition requires an approximate minimum of 20% of the time spent communicating in a particular language. This is because a language feature, a word or a grammatical construction, must be heard multiple times to be learned. Some learning may take place below this level of exposure, but it will not be sufficient for willing language use. As mentioned before, it is often the case that the exposure to a minority language is lacking and requires special attention. In terms of the quality of input, adequate language development requires a varied language input that is related to varied contexts and situations, varied topics and functions, varied speakers. A reasonably child-centered communication or communication that is directed to the child, suitable to the child's age, and stimulating the child to speak. In addition to sufficient language proficiency, for the willing use of a language, the child also needs a reason to use the language and a natural association between the language and one or all of the following: peers or friends, family members, and special times and activities. Let's now address the relationship between language attitudes and child's language development. Language attitudes are beliefs about or dispositions toward language. Positive language attitudes in the family and society are another prerequisite for the successful acquisition and willing use of a language by the child. Parents' language attitudes affect their own language practices and thereby the child's language input and development, and influence the child's language attitudes and thereby language learning and use. Here are some examples of positive language attitudes in the family and society. Importance of minority language. The minority language is valued in the family even when it might lack overt social prestige in the wider society. Appreciation for multilingualism. Knowing more languages is deemed possible and desirable and believed to benefit the child's development. Promotion of multiculturalism and multicultural identities. Simultaneously belonging to majority society and the minority community is deemed possible, acceptable, and not a necessary source of conflict on the individual or societal level. Parents' various language attitudes can be grouped as follows. Ideas about the social status and function of languages. For example, whether a minority language should be used in schooling. Attitudes toward particular types of language interactions. For example, whether language should be mixed. Ideas about language learning and bilingualism. For example, whether a majority language can be learned successfully later in the childhood. Ideas about parents' role in language socialization or impact belief. For example, whether parents believe that their language practices and attitudes can affect the child's language development and use. Parents' language practices and management have a direct impact on the child's language input by means of language choice, that is, which language is used, when and how consistently, interaction strategies, that is, ways of reacting to child's choice of language management strategies, that is, how the child's language input and use are extended. However, while very important, the child-parent relationship is not unidirectional. Children's own language use and attitudes impact parents' practices and beliefs. There are numerous pressures on families and their language policies, such as the following. Societal ideologies can be opposed to multilingualism or specific language groups and their languages, and there can be pressure to adopt the dominant language. Families can receive negative or misguided advice from family members, various early childhood development professionals, for instance, physicians or even teachers. Parents can have unrealistic expectations or lack of awareness of their own impact on child's language acquisition. The family's lower socioeconomic status and specific linguistic background may be an obstacle. Children can exert pressure on their family's language policy under the influence of their peers and the wider society. In conclusion, successful multilingual language acquisition is possible and common worldwide. Parental language practices and attitudes have a direct impact on the child's language development. Achieving age-appropriate language proficiency in the minority language benefits from explicit family language policy. Children play a role in their own language development. Thank you for listening.